progress.
Welcome, everybody. We're just going to give everybody a few seconds to finish entering. We'll get it started in a second. I still see people trickling in. All right, well, let's get started. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sarah Gomez, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Environmental Studies Program at Tufts University, which brings you the Hoke Cunningham Environmental Lecture Series every week, thanks to the generosity of Tufts alumni siblings Daphne Hoke Cunningham and Roland Hoke and their families. If you would like to receive weekly alerts about this lecture series, or if you're a student who would like to receive our newsletter, you can sign up for either or in the link that we will be posting in the chat. And also we'll post another link showing the remaining talks for the semester. Today's talk is co-hosted with our great partner, the Tisch College of Civic Life, which brings you this talk as part of their Civic Lunch series. And as you know, Tisch College brings great speakers to Tufts throughout the year. And while this is the last talk of their Civic Lunch series, they have quite a few excellent events coming up, including conversations with former advisor to President Obama, Dan Pfeiffer, New Jersey Governor and First Lady Phil and Tammy Murray, and one that I'm personally excited about, the famous primatologist, Dr. Jane Goodall. So if you want to find more about these events or sign up for them, just go to the link we will be posting in the chat. Finally, I would also like to thank other sponsors of today's talk, which include the Tufts English Department and the New Entry Sustainable Farming Project. Before we get started, I have an announcement to make for the students in the room. Environmental Studies is hosting its annual environmental photo contest. So if you are feeling artistic, make sure you submit some entries before Sunday. We'll put the link with instruction on the chat as well. And just a few housekeeping items. The chat is disabled. So if you have questions, make sure you put them in the Q&A section, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible at the end of the conversation we'll have today. The meeting is being recorded, so you will be able to access it within a day or two in our YouTube channel. We'll also put the link in the chat. And now to introduce today's speaker and moderator, I'll turn it over to my colleague and wonderful collaborator, Jessica Burns, who is a program manager and the director of the Tufts Campaign School at Tisch College of Civic Life. Jess?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Coco, for your work to make today's event possible. I also want to give a special thanks to Margot Biggin for her support of today's program. I'm Jess Burns. I manage events and communications at Tisch College, and we're thrilled to support today's talk with Julie Carrick Dalton. And if you haven't read her debut book, Waiting for the Night Song, I highly recommend it. After I introduce our speakers today, you'll hear from Julie first for a brief presentation about her new book, and then she'll be joined on screen for a conversation with Tufts lecturer, Dr. Ninian Stein. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Julie and Ninian. Julie Carrick Dalton grew up in Maryland and on a military base in Germany. She eventually found her way to Boston, where she's lived for the past 20 years. A journalist by trade, Julie's writing has appeared in outlets like the Boston Globe, Business Week, The Hollywood Reporter, and Electric Literature. She also contributes to the Chicago Review of Books, Dead Darlings, and The Writer Unboxed. Her debut novel, what we're here today to talk about, is called Waiting for the Night Song and was released earlier this year. The book combines two of Julie's passions, writing and climate change. In her book, she uses the lens of fiction and her love and connection to the natural world to present pressing issues of climate change and its effects on our communities in a cautiously hopeful way. It's been named the most anticipated 2021 book lists by CNN, Newsweek, USA Today, Parade, BuzzFeed, and others. And it was an Amazon editor's pick for best books of the month in January. Julie's won numerous awards for her writing, including the 2017 William Faulkner Literary Competition, and she's a frequent speaker and workshop leader on the topic of fiction in the age of climate crisis. She holds a master's degree in literature and creative writing from the Harvard Extension School, and she's an alum of Tin House, Grub Street's Novel Incubator Program, and the Friedman School's New Entry Sustainable Farming Project here at Tufts. She's also a member of the Climate Fiction Writers League. And if all of that weren't enough, she also owns and operates a small farm in rural New Hampshire. Her second novel, The Last Beekeeper, will be released in early 2023. Joining Julie in conversation today is Dr. Ninian Stein, Environmental Studies lecturer here at Tufts. Dr. Stein is an anthropological archaeologist and an environmental scientist with degrees in environmental studies, anthropology, and archaeology from Brown, Harvard, and the Yale School of the Environment. Dr. Stein's research looks at New England over the last 1,000 years through the lenses of landscape change, environmental policy and communication, and environmental justice. Here at Tufts, she teaches courses like environmental policy, introduction to environmental studies, environment communication and culture, and environmental racism and justice. Prior to her time at Tufts, Dr. Stein was previously a visiting assistant professor at Smith College and an assistant professor at San Jose State University. She was awarded the Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Teaching Fellowship from Wheaton College in 2009 and the Center for Environmental Studies Graduate Teaching Fellowship from Brown University in 2004, 2005, and 2006. Dr. Stein is currently finishing her upcoming book, Not Your Average Run of the Mill, combining environmental history and industrial archaeology to shape the future of factory sites, which is based on her environmental and anthropological study of a textile mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and its transformation into an artist's community. Once published, her book will offer techniques for transforming old industrial buildings into vibrant spaces for the community. And with that, I'm looking forward to a really great conversation. I know all of you are as well. So it's my pleasure to introduce Julie Carrick Dalton.
Hi, well, thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you for that great introduction. My name is Julie Carrick Dalton. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm just really grateful to be here. I'm honored to be this event to be sponsored by so many different parts of the university, because I think climate crisis is something that we all need to be talking about. So I thought I would start out by telling you a little bit about my book and a little bit about what I think climate fiction is, how my book fits into this broader category of literature, and why I believe it matters so much right now. So Waiting for the Night Song is primarily, it's a story about a fierce friendship between two women. It's about secrets and betrayal, and it's set against the backdrop of a changing climate in a small New England town. The story is told in a dual timeline narrative. So there is alternating chapters between my main character, Katie Kessler, when she's an 11-year-old girl. And in this timeline, Katie and her best friend, Daniela, witness a traumatic incident as children, and they choose to cover it up for reasons that make sense to an 11-year-old. But they have to live with the ramifications of covering up this crime for the rest of their life, and it haunts them. In the adult timeline, Katie Kessler is now an entomologist working for the forestry department, and she's trying to prove that an invasive beetle has moved into the forest of New Hampshire. The beetle is called the mountain pine bark beetle, which is a very real beetle that you may have seen in news stories. It's affected the forests in California, Colorado, and other parts of the West that have been killing off forests and contributing to these catastrophic forest fires. So in my book, I used some fictional license, and I invited this beetle to New Hampshire. And so my character is trying to prove that it's there. But in my story, she is up against a climate denialist government, and the administration has cut off access to environmental research on federal land. So when we meet her in the beginning of the book, Katie knows this beetle's there, and she knows she has the potential to maybe stop a fire. But she has to make a decision whether she's going to trespass into this national forest to collect samples and prove her case, or is she going to just stand by and follow the rules? If she goes into the forest, she risks getting arrested, losing her job, and potentially her whole career. But if she doesn't go, can she live with the ramifications of not having tried to stop the fire? So she's at this pivotal point in her career, but at the same time, she gets a text from this childhood friend, Daniela, who she hasn't talked to in decades. And the text just says, they found him. Now, this isn't a big spoiler for my story because this all happens in the first chapter, but the text is referring to a body that's buried in the woods that's been unearthed in the woods that Katie and Daniela played in when they were children. And Katie and Daniela may be the only two people that really know what happened. So the two of them have to go home to their childhood hometown and face up to the fallout of having covered up this really big secret for their entire lives now that someone is being falsely accused of this murder. So that is the story in a nutshell. And it's all happening against a changing climate in a very slow burning way. It's not a climate disaster story. So my book it's set in this insular agricultural town in New England, which most people don't think of as the epicenter of the climate crisis. So I did a lot of work of trying to connect these barely visible threads from New England to other parts of the world and climate change. And I think that now, most people understand that the effects of the climate crisis tend to hit Black and Brown, Indigenous and poor communities first and worst. And it's really easy to go through my day living here in a suburb of Boston and not think about the direct impact it has on me every day. I have food, I have water, I have relative security. And I think that there's this myopic view in general, not from everyone, but in the United States in general, the climate crisis is something that's coming. It's this looming future event to prepare for. But the reality is, in many parts of the world, and including our own country, it's already, the climate apocalypse has arrived and people are living through it. So climate fiction, which I think of as fiction that engages climate science in a meaningful way. Climate fiction presents a vehicle to show readers what our future might look like, or to show us someone else's current reality. So I could say that I want to change the way people think, that feel through my writing, but that might feel a little manipulative or aggressive. I like to talk about climate fiction as a way to stir empathy, because if you can change someone's heart or make a reader see themselves in a story, that's when hearts and minds change and open. So if you think about it, reading fiction is an enormous act of empathy. A reader is choosing to set aside their own worldview for a minute or for 10 hours to read a novel and see the world through somebody else's eyes. And I, as an author, I get to craft the lens that the readers view my world through, which is, it's, to me, really exciting. So climate fiction can transport readers into a near future where most animals are extinct because of the climate crisis, as in Charlotte McConaughey's 2020 novel called Migrations, which is, I highly recommend this book. It's a great, if you want to try a climate fiction novel and you haven't before, this is a wonderful starting place. It's a beautiful story, really compelling characters. Climate fiction can put readers in the path of a hurricane, like Hurricane Katrina, and leave them on the ground after the waters recede, as in Jessamine Ward's Salvage the Bones. So climate fiction could show us a future where the western parts of the United States have turned into a moving desert that's unfit for human life. And I'm thinking of books like Gold Famed Citrus by Claire Watkins and The Water Knife by Paolo Bacigalupi. So these writers are inviting us to imagine a climate future or a contemporary reality that might not look like our reality. And they're inviting us to live in it. And when the book's over, hopefully, the reader is left with these secondhand memories of what it might be like and how the characters might feel. And if we care about the story and we care about the characters, we empathize with them. And that's where the work starts. So I'm going to share two little tiny stories about how I think climate fiction has changed. And so about, I don't know if it was maybe 12 or 15 years ago, I lost track of time, but I got into a conversation, maybe an argument with a friend about climate change, about the climate crisis, if it was real or if it was a hoax. And it was around the time that Al Gore's documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, had come out with its companion book, and I was reading the book, and my friend was making fun of me for believing this hoax, this liberal hoax. And so we got into it a little bit, and he told me he had just read a book that debunked all of Al Gore's theories, and it proved that it was a hoax and it was a tool from the liberal left. So I said, okay, if you read Al Gore's book, I will read your book, and let's talk about it afterwards. What's the book? And he named the book, and it was called State of Fear by Michael Crichton. It was a novel. It was a novel written by the same person who wrote Jurassic Park. And my friend was using this And that was the moment that I will always remember, that I realized how much power there was in fiction, that this climate denialist perspective and state of fear had changed someone's view of the world. And I wanted to write a different book. So I'll tell you another quick story from the other end of the perspective. A book blogger recently wrote a review of my novel, Waiting for the Night Song. And you can usually tell when you start a review in the first couple sentences if it's going to be a good review or a not so good review. And this one started out tough. It said, I'm not quoting verbatim, but I don't like books about politics. I'm not interested in climate change because it's not affecting me, and I don't watch the news. So I immediately braced myself for a scathing review. And then the author of this review went on to say, but I love the characters. I love the story, and I was engaged. And by the end of the book, I cared about what the characters cared about. And now I care about climate change. And that right there, I think, is the power of climate fiction. It can help people empathize and see the world through someone else's eyes. So I'm not a scientist. I'm not an environmentalist. And I don't necessarily consider myself an activist unless there's a famous quote from Toni Morrison about saying that writing is a form of activism. So in that case, maybe I am, because I do have ideas I want to share with the world. And as much as I would like readers to pick up my book and think about big themes about climate and about the world and our role in it, for me, it's really about the characters in the story. They have to come first, because if I want someone to engage with my writing, they need to care about the book. They need to care about the characters and the story. And if they don't turn the page and get to the end of the book, my message will never get through. So in the end, it needs to be always about the story. A compelling story can be the delivery mechanism. And I'm really excited that there's so many authors entering this new dynamic place in literature. It's showing up in post-apocalyptic stories and dystopian stories and thrillers and mysteries. There's a diverse range of authors writing climate fiction right now. And I find it very exciting, and especially in the young adult literature. There's some really amazing stories coming out. And I think that it leaves room for contemplation, but also for hope. And so I'm going to pause right there and invite Ninian back into the conversation, because I know she had some questions and wanted to talk about, but I think that might be a good entry into climate fiction. So I'm excited to hear what questions Ninian has today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful beginning, Julie. And thank you, Jessica, for the wonderful introduction as well. To begin with, Julie, please tell us about your career journey. What brought you to write, to your journey that brought you to write Waiting for the Night Song?
Well, I'm a journalist. I got an undergrad degree in journalism, and I kind of went this traditional path of community journalism and then magazines, and I wrote for the Globe and for Business Week, and I still write for a bunch of publications. I mostly just write about writing at this point. I write about literature. But it wasn't until I guess I started writing this book 13 years ago. It took a long time for this book to see the light of day. So I had a long time to think about it. But during those same years, I built a farm. My husband and I bought a piece of land, and we built and developed this land at the same time that I was writing my book. And there are a lot of elements of my farm, of agricultural research and forestry research, that emerge in my story. So it was, I think about the farm and my book as two parts of the same story. Part of my book actually influenced decisions I made on my farm, and things I did researching agriculture influenced my book. There's, in particular, I'll tell you, there's one piece of information that does show up briefly in my book, that the growing season in my region in New Hampshire has been extended by 22 days in the past century, which is kind of shocking if you think about having 3 more weeks. And that little nugget of information shaped my book a lot, because I kept thinking it's a slow burning rise in temperature. You don't think it's not a catastrophic wall of water rushing in. It's a slow burn. And how does that change a community over time? So it was a combination of the journalism, the storytelling that I think is just part of my nature, and agriculture that really kind of brought me to where I am right now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Great to know. It's maybe thinking about, how do I dip my toes into these waters? And students, feel free to ask follow-up questions about that if you're interested. Continuing with the theme of storytelling, in your opinion, what is the transformational power of climate fiction, and more broadly, storytelling about climate change? You've told us a little bit in your opening remarks, but is there more you could expand on?
Yeah, I think there's a lot, because I think that writers are approaching climate stories from a lot of perspectives. I briefly mentioned this, that there's, I mean, there are romance novels that are engaging climate science. There's a book that came out in January called Shipped, and it's a rom-com on a cruise to the Galapagos, but it engages meaningful conversations about climate. And these, you know, in YA in particular, I'm seeing a ton of really important work coming out from a wide range of voices, a lot of diversity in this corner of literature. And I think more so than in literature in general, and I mean, I don't have any scientific data to back this up, but I feel like the writers who are emerging in climate fiction are representing more voices than in literature more broadly. We're seeing a lot of Indigenous writers bringing just incredible stories out. There's a lot of Black writers, and I mean, the voices are coming from everywhere, and they're representing a lot of different stories. And I think it's because young people are craving these stories, because this is their future, and this is a way for writers to explore fears. I think there's a reactive side and a proactive side of writing climate fiction, and I'm processing my world, just like any artist is processing the world through art. I'm processing my fears. I'm processing hope. I'm thinking about, how to be resilient. How are we going to be adapt to the future? And these themes come out in literature, and it lets us, process our own fears, my own fears. And then there's the proactive side. As a writer, I want you to think about what I'm writing about. Like, I want you to sit with my book afterwards and maybe talk about it with somebody, share it with somebody, have a conversation. And so I think it has this ability to process things that we're all thinking about and give us a way to discuss them. So I think that, to me, might be one of the most exciting things about climate fiction.
Completely agree, completely agree. Very briefly, how does climate fiction relate to other subgenres such as solar punk fiction?
Yeah, so I feel like you know a little bit more about solar punk than I do. I'm not as widely read, although I'm familiar with it as a genre, but I'm not widely read in solar punk. But what I know is, I think it's like it's the optimist corner of climate fiction. There's a lot of room for gloom and doom and sadness and despair if we talk about climate change. But there's more optimism of these sustainable futures and technologies and ways we can survive in a different future that are coming out from solar punk, which I think we all need. I guess if we think there's nothing worth saving, no one's going to do anything. And if we can see a future that looks hopeful, there's something to fight for. And so I think that is speaking to a younger generation a little bit more, the solar punk genre, not exclusively, but I think it's being more widely read by young people. And I think it's because they need hope, because that's their future. And these books are showing them, a way to think about it in a hopeful way, not a Pollyannic way. And I don't think we need to whitewash and pretend that there's not a problem. But I think if we eliminate room for hope, it doesn't make us stir us to action as much.
My class was just discussing some solar punk fiction earlier today, and one of the quotes that we read in a book, an excerpt from the wonderful book Octavia's Brood, was talking about, they're talking about visionary fiction specifically, and they said that visionary fiction is realistic and hard but hopeful. Yeah,
I think that's really important, because you can't pretend that everything's great. But at the same time, we can't ignore that there is hope.
And in fact, one of the forms that hope can take, there's a question already in the Q&A that really directly relates to this. I'm going to insert it here. And the question is, so much of climate fiction is dystopian or futuristic, based in a future after people, particularly in the US, but also around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Have you failed, where people, particularly in the US, have failed to take the necessary action to address the crisis? And the writer is asking us to identify books about characters who have taken action for climate justice, or characters who have arcs that are moving into action about the climate crisis.
Oh, okay. So yeah, thank you for that question. So there's actually a book that just came out in January. It's called The Effort by an author named Claire Holroyd. now, I can't remember if the date is actually named, but it's about the Earth is already experiencing some climate change elements, but there's also a comet hurtling towards Earth that threatens to, eliminate everything. And it's about scientists from around the world, from different countries, different cultures, have to work together. And it ends up being the scientists that work together because the political leaders fail.
Recording in progress.
Completely agree. And I think we could expand that conversation. We may return to it because there's
a lot of other
that arc of moving into action is a rising theme, I think. Just going to move on with our questions. I suspect we'll return to both the themes of hope and that arc of action.
Absolutely.
Where do you think Cli-Fi and climate storytelling fit in a university context? Should we be assigning Cli-Fi or having our students write fictional or non-fictional stories in environmental studies classes or civic studies classes, for example?
Yes, and yes. I think that I think there's well, for one thing, I think it's a really growing category. It isn't an official genre. I think that if you go into a bookstore or a library, in most cases, you're not going to find the climate fiction shelf. Or even if you go onto Amazon and look at the categories, there is no category on Amazon. It's a subcategory of a lot of genres. It's in, like I said, it's in romance and YA, thrillers, mysteries, crime, dystopian. It's everywhere. And so, and there's contemporary novels, like my novel. It's often called a thriller or a suspense novel or climate fiction. It's a contemporary story. It's a story that could happen tomorrow. It's not dystopian or apocalyptic in any way, but I think all of them have something to offer, especially as a teaching tool. There's, allegory is really powerful, parables. Like, I think of books like Parable of the Sower, which was one of the, the first titles that I think of, when you think of this climate fiction, Octavia Butler's classic Parable of the Sower. And there's a lot of storytelling that engages people in different ways. Like it can engage on issues of race, climate justice, other issues of social justice, and it has teaching tools. So, depending on what category you're trying to teach or if you're teaching a class on environmental justice, there's so many books out there. That will bring students in the conversation. But I love the idea of having them write, because I think that's, like I was saying before, these reactive ways of processing our own climate fears. I think that what young people have to say is very relevant, and I would like to read what they're writing. I know that I've gone in and been a speaker in high schools and talked to classes that are specifically climate fiction classes in high schools already, and I love that it's something that's on the radar for professors and teachers, because it young people.
I really want to highlight historical fiction in the category of climate fiction along those lines as well.
Yeah.
It's something I've taught in environmental history courses, and strongly encourage students to consider historical fiction in the genre of climate fiction, looking at past hurricanes in the 1800s, for example.
Well, that I don't know if you've heard of, there's an author named Omar El-Akkad. He's an Egyptian-Canadian writer. I highly recommend it. He wrote a book called American War, which is one of my favorite books, if borderline, maybe my favorite book in this category, at least in the top 5. I love this book, and it's set in the near future of the United States that's undergone a second civil war. And in the South secedes on issues of wanting to cling to fossil fuels as part of like their culture, and similar echoes of how they seceded clinging to slavery. And this book, it opens up all these ideas about climate change and climate justice and what our world could look like. But the thing I love about Omar El-Akkad is I've heard him speak about it, and he says someday all fiction is going to be climate fiction, because we're not going to be able to write about anything without acknowledging what's going on around us. And it doesn't have to be in your face climate fiction, but like you said, historical fiction, to look back at history. If we're living through a climate crisis, to look back at history and not see the difference, or to acknowledge, like you said, hurricanes or fires or things in the past, and not acknowledge how they are all tied to nature and the environment. I think that it's just something we're more attuned to now. But I agree, even historical fiction definitely can fall into that.
Thank you so much for all of these wonderful answers. And one of the reasons I was so excited about joining you in this conversation today is to participate in the environmental humanities track in our environmental studies major and co-major. For one of my courses, I'm assigning Cli-Fi and solar punk short stories in my ENV 195 environmental racism and justice course this spring. How are Cli-Fi and related genres amplifying diverse voices and offering innovative visions of futures beyond structural environmental racism and other contemporary challenges?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I would start by some books that aren't that are contemporary, that we can see ourselves in. And I think a really good one to read is Salvage the Bones by Jessamine Ward, if you've read that. For anyone who hasn't read it, it's about the 12 days, I think, leading up to Hurricane Katrina. It's about a Black family in Mississippi. And as they're preparing, so we as a reader know that Katrina is going to be devastating, but of course the characters don't know. So we're reading and the tension's building as it's getting closer, and people are starting to get worried. And in this parish in Mississippi, a lot of the wealthier white families are boarding up their homes, they're packing up, and they're getting out of town. But the poor Black families, they don't have the resources to protect their homes in the same way, and they can't leave. And so it's a stark contrast. There's a scene and the characters go out and they're stealing wood off of another building to bring home, to board up the windows in their own home just to protect what they have. And it's a stark contrast in the inequality in this community and how people with resources can escape. And I think that's going back to this idea I said before, how we have this kind of myopic view of the world, that it's already here. It's just some people are feeling it and others aren't. And as far as the voices telling these stories, there are so many amazing authors entering this. There's several Indigenous authors, particularly in the YA arena, that are thinking of Rebecca Roanhorse. She wrote a book called Trail of Lightning. I think you've read that as well. And it's a fantastic story. It engages Indigenous mythology, and it's fantastical, and it has this powerful, female character. But it's set in a world in the future where climate has completely changed our world, but it's told through the lens or the voice with Indigenous wisdom and storytelling structures. And it's a really wonderful book. And then there's The Marrow Thieves, which is another book by an Indigenous author. I'm going to get her, Sherry Dimaline. Is that?
Cheryl Dimaline.
Yes. So, and these books have done really well. They've been reviewed really well and widely read. There are a lot of other YA books coming out. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. The Gilded Ones. Have you heard of this book? It's a new YA book that just came out in the past couple of months. I don't know exactly. I think the author's name is Namina Forna, I believe. And she's a Black woman, and it's set in this kind of futuristic world where it has this dystopian feel, but that there's a time where the characters are given this test of what kind of blood they have. And if your blood runs gold, like the Gilded Ones, you're sent to a different type of life. And if you have regular blood, so it has that dystopian Hunger Games kind of fantastic element to it, set in a climate, an unstable climate. So I think I could go on and on about these voices, and I think we could have a whole nother conversation of me just rattling off names, but I think there's a richness in climate fiction of different voices coming out. And I think it's because a lot of people who are being affected tend, not always, but in a lot of cases, are the first and worst hit by climate crisis are in Black and Brown and even just in climate data, which I know you probably already know all this, but the data shows that even in our country, Black communities are closer to coal plants, their pollution is worse. So it isn't just climate disasters like rising water or flooding, it's air pollution that these communities are feeling more acutely. And so it doesn't surprise me that some of the most brilliant literature coming out in this genre is coming from
bad guys are residential school, and there's kind of an echo of the past as well as a future element to this. Is there more you could say about the emerging genre of Indigenous climate fiction, Indigenous science fiction, and visionary?
Yeah, well, I will first say I don't consider myself an expert on this in particular, but I'm excited about the stories that are coming out, and I think they're important. And I think that this idea of bringing history forward is important, and I think we're talking about it more now, which I'm glad about. And I also could relate it to things that are happening in the news right now. I just read an article. I don't know if it just came out yesterday, or maybe I just read it yesterday, but they're talking about evaluating forests in different parts of the world that are managed by traditional tribal communities, and how much the wisdom connected to the land in these communities has kept their forests healthier, and there's less fires in them because they're managed. And when we displace communities from their land, that wisdom's lost to the land, not the wisdom of the people lost, but the way it's enacted in the land. And so, we're seeing this playing out where different, forest protector communities are preserving forests in a way that makes them less vulnerable to fires. And if we could engage that wisdom on a broader level, we wouldn't be fighting as many of these forest fires. I'm not going to say we wouldn't be fighting any of them, because that's not realistic, but I think these stories that are bringing forward wisdom, history, and tradition are adding to the conversation, not just in fiction, but in how we should be treating our land and different people's connections to the land. And I think that there's a lot more to come. There's also, not just in YA literature, but like Louise Erdrich, her book, Future Home of the Living God, kind of delves into this conversations, an Indigenous writer. So I think that is a category that I'm excited to see it grow. And I also will say that this is something that really helped me define my interest in climate fiction. A few years ago, I went to a panel at the Sundance Film Festival. It was organized by a leader from Black Lives Matter in Canada. And she invited all these Indigenous leaders from around the world, all these different, the Amazon island nations in the United States. And they came together to talk about this very thing, about how losing land and the wisdom connected to it is going to affect all of us. And so the more we can talk about it and the more it comes out in literature, the better off we all will be.
And how we can celebrate those communities who kept that knowledge alive despite being displaced from land.
Absolutely.
As well, and celebrate that presence and persistence and resilience that we do see in the face of things like residential schools and Indigenous communities around the world, keeping that knowledge alive across generations.
Absolutely.
And speaking of not keeping knowledge alive, women's voices in storytelling are also very much emergent in climate fiction. What are the roles of women's voices in storytelling, both in climate fiction and related genres?
Yeah, so there are some pretty exciting voices. There's a book called The Water Cure, if you've heard of this, by Sophie McIntosh, which is this, like eco-feminist, dreamy novel. It's set in this undefined future. There's been an undefined environmental catastrophe in the background. And these three young girls live with their parents on an island in this very secluded patriarchal system, and they've been told the environment is dangerous. Everything off this island is dangerous, and that men are even more dangerous. And it has these, and then the father disappears, and the young girls have to find their own way and make their own judgments about what is real in the world and what they've been taught, and how they have to grow and find this strength in them to face up to environmental issues and the climate, to their own resources within them, and defining their relationship to men in the world. And it's a great book. It has this, I think of it almost in this like sepia tones. It's got this I definitely recommend it. And then there's all these other books that I would say fall into this ecofeminism. And I think you could even think of books like Sula or Temple of My Familiar, for Alice Walker, that there are these tones of ecofeminism, of a female and feminine connection to the land and the power in that relationship. I think is pretty bold, powerful women, like in Lightning Thief, having these women stepping up with being the superheroes in the stories, and not all of them. And there are some fantastic male characters in these books as well, but they are centering women in the climate sphere in a lot of these books. And I think that's pretty powerful right now.
I want to mention one of my favorite books, Remnant Population, which isn't as strongly science fiction, isn't as strongly climate. It's sort of humanity has escaped Earth and is settling other worlds, and it's a first contact novel, and it deals with age discrimination among other issues.
Oh, what can you repeat the name?
Absolutely, it's Remnant Population.
Okay, I don't know that one. I'll have to look that up. I love hearing new titles. So if you have some recommendations for me, please throw them in, because I love adding to my towering pile of books.
Absolutely, and in fact, a lot of the questions in the Q&A are pointing us towards asking for recommendations. One says, can you point to any resources for finding lists of contemporary climate fiction authors? Another says, how do you seek out this genre? How do you look for it when it's not already organized as a genre? So how do you find it?
Yeah, so you have to do some digging. You're not going to find, there are articles, like if you go into Google and Google climate fiction, you'll find some. I've written a couple articles myself. I wrote one recently that was published in Electric Literature that was a list of books that deal with species extinction, and specifically. And I also wrote a book during the election cycle about books I thought all the presidential candidates should read about climate change. And it had to do with issues of climate justice and things, the messages in these books that I wanted the president, this was during the primary season, that I thought all these presidential candidates needed to be reading. That was, I think that was also published by Electric Literature. So if you Google my name in Electric Literature, you'll find a couple great lists of some mostly contemporary books, but a few classics. But there aren't sections in libraries or bookstores yet. There will be. I'm hopeful that there will be someday. And something else we didn't touch on, I think there's some really great writers that are gender nonconforming and trans writers that are in this space that are doing some amazing work. There's a book I wanted to highlight. It's called Depart. It's actually on my bookshelf right here. But it's a novella. It's a very thin book. It's a very quick read. You can, I'm not sure how many pages it is, but it's by a trans non-binary author named Kim Kern, and it's set in the wake of a climate disaster in Houston, which I feel like we can all relate to a lot right now. And it's a catastrophic flood, one that would dwarf what happened in Katrina. It's a huge flood. And it's about this group that finds refuge in a stadium, like happened in Katrina. And this found family of trans, queer, and gender nonconforming refugees in the climate that find each other and build a community, like a found family in the midst of this crisis. Has to do with identity, climate change. There's even a ghost in this book. There's so much to love. I mean, look how it's very thin. It's a novella, but there's so much in this. So I highly recommend this author, Kim Kern. This is, I believe it's their first publication, and I'm very hopeful that they will be publishing more, because I think they have a great voice. And they're not the only one, but I think that there's voices coming from so many different places, and they all have something to add to this, this broad category of fiction.
And we can talk, there's some questions about YA, and I would mention graphic novels. I've been reading my daughter, the 5 Worlds series, which is definitely playing with climate fiction. It's set in alternate universe, so not on Earth, but the characters have from 5 different worlds with more than 5 different races, not only human, but there's also living oil is one of the races,
Oh, wow.
which is really cool. And
Yeah.
have to navigate trying to light these beacons that were designed to combat climate change that was going to be coming to these worlds.
I would love to hear more, but I feel like you are definitely more of an expert on the children's fiction and the graphic novel. So I'm very excited to, maybe explore this a bit more. I'm more in tune with YA and adult, but I think there's some pretty exciting stuff going on in these other areas as well.
And so one of the things I would encourage readers to look for in this genre, if we're looking for how we help children feel empowered, is to feel like there's things they can do that are making a difference, and if they feel like the adults in their lives are making a difference. The book Raising Elijah says you have to show them you're part of the resistance, and that you're not just standing by passively watching it happen, but that you are actively trying to make a difference. So I look for that. I think Ivy and Bean, which is a great book for young readers about two little girls who are best friends, they try to solve climate change, and it feels like the children are trying to solve it alone. And I think it's actually, I love that the author has brought up the issue and brought up children's fears. But I do think to give children more of a sense of agency, one of the important things that we can do is to show adults and children working to solve even tiny pieces. I would point us towards looking for those genres of adults and children working together, or children strongly empowered, having really strong sense that even if you can't solve it all, you can take it in pieces and work on those pieces.
Yeah.
And let's see, this addresses contemporary YA we've already talked about. Let's see, a question about climate change. Oh, very, very question that's very apropos of your comment about there being 22 days of extended growing season. Of course, one of the other predictions are Director of Energy and Environment in the City of Medford often says we're going to have 5 more days a year in the next 2 years of 90 days over 95 degrees as part of that extended growing season. And one of our questions from the audience is, one of the big ways that climate change is affecting Boston is the relative slight heating of Boston summers is disproportionately heating people who cannot have AC in their homes, and those 5 days above 95 degrees extra. And she writes, you mentioned your book deals with the impact. How important do you think it is for books that aren't specifically Cli-Fi to mention these sorts of changes in the background?
That's a very interesting way to frame the question, because that goes back to what I was saying, that Omar Al-Akkad comment about how someday all fiction will be climate fiction in a way, because it's so pervasive. I think it would be hard to tell a contemporary story without in some way engaging it. And also just as I think literature doesn't owe us anything. Like, literature does not exist to teach us lessons. So I don't think we should be telling authors they have to take on big themes. I think if that's something that they're compelled to do, I think it's really important in telling these stories. But I feel like it's going to be emerging, just, like I said, it's emerging in rom-coms, in romance novels. And I think it's a more pervasive part of our everyday life. And it's very true. I mean, in Boston, the issues of inequality and everywhere, not just Boston, but I know it's very pronounced here, that these, what I tried to do in my book is look at this small insular town in the different ways that it was, there are farm foreclosures, crop failures, there's displaced migrant labor, there's the threat of fire, there's just the visuals of a more brittle forest, all these different things, but at the center of the story doesn't look like a disaster. There is not a feeling that this is a disaster novel. And I think that is what we're, where I am here, in the Boston area, it's not a disaster on this huge scope, but it's a lot of small disasters, that we are going to be creeping into our literature because that's part of our life. I mean, it's going to be hard to not write about these things. So I don't think we should be putting it on writers as to owe it to anyone or as a responsibility, but I don't think we're going to be able to avoid it because it's part of our existence.
And 2 different questions. One of the questions is, I find myself being excited by facts, but worry they may bore my readers. And another writer asks, how intimately is the narrative process linked with scientific literature? Scientific journal articles are often inaccessible. As an ecologist, I'm curious how to root the climate component of climate fiction. I think you're a wonderful person to ask this question. I think you do a wonderful job in Waiting for the Night Song, bringing those details to life in ways that feel very tangible.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's important to represent the science as accurately as possible. As I mentioned, I used some license and brought this beetle to New Hampshire, but it's a real beetle and the conditions are real and the impact of the beetle is real. And I think that it would, getting those facts as accurate as possible is important in getting those stories out there. And one of the things about that whole storyline with the beetles that was so exciting to me is I read an article in Mother Jones years ago about a scientist studying the mountain pine bark beetle. And in this article, the main person being interviewed peels back the wood, the bark, and you see the beetle. And it set my mind on fire of this little tiny beetle that can destroy a tree, that can destroy a forest, that could set a fire in motion. And yet it's a tiny beetle. And when you look at the destruction, the actual destruction to the tree, they burrow in and they carve these little tiny lines and they're beautiful. I mean, they look like art, like the little burrows that this beetle makes in the woods are stunning. And this whole idea of this tiny creature creating something beautiful that is destroying the forest is a story. It's a story right there. That's like a whole novel right there, is this little tiny beetle. And I think if we can find the storytelling in science ways, so I started following all these entomologists on Twitter and like eavesdropping on science Twitter and entomology Twitter. And to me, the science was so not boring. So I threw in the science that felt like part of the story, and it never occurred to me while I was writing it to take any of it out because it was too much. Because I was like, this is like, who wouldn't be interested in this stuff? There's an author I didn't mention earlier, but I really recommend. Her name's Erica Swiler, and she wrote a book called The Light from Other Stars. And it's a climate fiction novel, and it has a lot of science in it, and more science in it than my book, and it's more speculative than my book as well. And she and I have had some conversations or exchanges, and she said that people pushed back on her. There's too much science in this. This is boring. I read that book, so not boring. The science was so part of the story. So it's going to depend on your reader. But I say put the science out there. Let other people fall in love with the science and want to see that beetle, and get excited about this stuff because it's important. We want people to be excited about science because that's how we're going to move forward, and also admire the beauty in it. Like this beetle, I have floorboards in my bedroom that are milled from trees that were being attacked by insects, and you can see it in the wood on my floor that I walk over every day. And I'm aware that this is destruction that's happening to this tree, and I'm also aware that it's like incredibly beautiful and it's telling a story in this wood on my bedroom floor. So I say bring on the science, tell the story as best you can, and your readers are going to find you.
Wonderful answer. Thank you so much. And our next question is from one of my colleagues who teaches writing and creative writing and creative nonfiction writing here at Tufts, Grace Talusan. And she writes, "Hi, Julie. As a fellow writer who becomes immersed into whatever I'm writing, how did you take care of yourself or talk to yourself in order to cope and write and continue to live your life with the often frightening predictions about climate change?"
That's a great question. Thank you, Grace. I do know Grace. We both are part of the Grub Street writing community together. That's a really good question. So as I mentioned early in the beginning of the talk, when I was building my farm, at the same time I was writing the book, but the backstory is this piece of land went on the market near our family home, and it was a tract of pristine forest that was being sold off for timber and development. And we had bear, moose, and deer that would come out of those woods and walk into our yard. This is at a family place in New Hampshire. And the idea of these woods being clear cut, and they were already starting, the owner was clear cutting the land while it was on the market. And it got in my head so much, I couldn't stand the idea of it. And so we ended up buying the piece of land, and we needed to have a business reason for owning the land. So we built a farm. We built a farm as the back door is a reason because I didn't want moose to be homeless. That was the reason I went into farming, so the moose wouldn't be homeless. So we preserved like 92 acres of the land, just the area that was already cleared. We built the farm, and that working on the farm is therapy for me. I'm working on building my soil organically. The classes that I've taken through New Entry at Tufts have been incredibly helpful in terms of connecting with other farmers in a community. But for me, holding on to that forest and putting it in conservation so it can't be developed. And I also opened it up so that the walking trails in my woods are open to other people. Anybody can come through the walking trails in my woods, and they're treated like a national or a state park in New Hampshire, even though I own it. So doing small things, and there are a lot of days I was out at the farm, like digging in the dirt all day, hot, sweaty, smelly, exhausted, and I would be thinking about story while I was working on the farm. And then I would come home and try to, jot it all down after having pre-writing in my head. And for me, the connection to being part of the soil, the land, and the trees, my forest is really important to me. And I didn't know a ton about forestry before I owned this property, but one of the things that really got in my head was a map of the sugar maples in New Hampshire. Is the bottom edge of the map of where sugar maples exist is very slowly going north. And for me, the fear is like one day those iconic New Hampshire maples aren't going to be in New Hampshire anymore. They're going to be in Canada. And that's a really real threat. So for me, being close to the land and doing what I can to take care of it and being engaged in the conversation is therapeutic for me. I don't think I would have written this book in the same way if I weren't digging in the dirt all day long. I don't think my farm would exist in the same way it does if I hadn't been writing the book at night. So they're, for me, like two sides of a coin.
Wonderful, thank you. Wonderful answer. I'm just looking at the questions because we have about 4 minutes remaining. I'm looking at the questions. Someone asks, have we read How to Talk to Your Children About Climate Change, Turning Angst into Action by Harriet Sugarman? I actually have not read that, but I've written it down and I will certainly look it up.
I haven't read it either, but it sounds wonderful. I'm glad people are writing these.
Completely agreed, completely agreed. And see, there's a piece of a question that we've answered most of, but I'm going to go back and rephrase the last part that we haven't finished answering. As an ecologist, I'm curious how rooted the climate component of climate fiction is in the emerging scientific understanding, and how scientists can better contribute or participate in this form of communication.
Ooh, I like that. You know what I would love? I would love to see a conference or a forum where writers and scientists that are thinking about these things can talk to each other. Because I think that the science, it depends on the genre. Like mine is a contemporary realistic novel. There's, stories that take place in space that are, you can make up the world and make up the science. So I don't want to say you can't tell a climate fiction story if you're not adhering to strict science, because I think there's room in fantasy and science fiction to be really creative, and it's the themes. And so they're kind of like the harbingers, like the beetles and the bees. My second novel that I have coming out in 2023 is about bees, about honeybees. And so I think that if we could set up a forum where we could get these scientists talking to these writers, we would have some amazing books coming out, and we can do a talk about that next year.
And Colin says, why don't we plan such a, Colin Orange, who's the director of environmental studies here at Tufts, says, why don't we plan such a conference and talk? So,
I would absolutely love to participate in that, because I would love to pick the brains of all those scientists and come up with some new story ideas for myself.
I think it's a plan.
All right, let's do it.
Hooray. And we have 2 minutes remaining. So we have some questions of just expressing gratitude. Oh, Colin, did you want to say? Okay, and then the question asking quickly about staying motivated over the years. I just wanted to point quickly to the book, The Impossible Will Take a Little While, Persevere in Troubled Times, and say for yourself, how do you persevere in troubled times?
Wow, that's a big question in this moment, isn't it? Yeah, as far as perseverance as a writer, that's a tough one, because you just have to believe. Writing this book took 13 years, and I had no idea if anybody was ever going to want it or read it, but I had a compulsion in me to tell the story. I felt like I needed to tell the story, and if somebody was going to read it, that's great, but I'm going to tell it no matter what. So I had an internal driver to write this book and to get it out into the world and try to find readers and connect with them and talk to people like you and share my story. As a human being, as a parent, I have 4 children. I think that I'm an optimist, and I have hope, and I see the bad things that are happening, and I see a future that looks less optimistic than, you know, I would hope for it to be, but I see so much, I see hope, and I see reasons to fight for hope and to engage stories that, not in a Pollyanna-ish way, I don't want to pretend these things aren't real, but I think if we don't truly believe that there's a reason to fight for them, we're not going to fight. And so I think I just am an eternal optimist. I have my bad days, but I you know, my story, I feel like it ends on a hopeful note. It's not a happy ending tied up with a neat bow, but there's optimism there. And I think there is in my next book too, because I think we need it. I think it's vital. And I also think it's real. I don't think it's sugar-coated optimism. I think there are real reasons. There's scientists out there doing amazing work, and you know, activists that are doing, you know, the hard work. And I'm just sitting home writing about it. So I feel like those are the heroes that, you know, I want to be writing about and engaging. And that's what keeps me going.
We need those new stories and new narratives for those writers.
Yes.
To create for all of us to create the new worlds.
Absolutely.
Right at 1 o'clock. So I want to make sure that anyone who needs to go on to the lunch and learn conversations or other classes can go, but I'm happy to stay for a few minutes also if there are people who want to stay and ask a few additional questions.
But that's great.
We're finishing.
Recording stopped.
Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to all of our to Tisch College and all of the people who contributed to make today's event possible.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. This has been a really great conversation, and I'm so happy that more people, that this many people showed up and want to engage in this conversation, because to me, this is the most exciting topic in the world. This growing category of literature is, you know, just, I could talk about it for hours, and just to see how many people came to talk about it, it's really encouraging.
Completely agree. I could talk about it for hours as well.
I really loved it. That was fantastic. Thank you so much.